Okay. Okay, can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you kindly. So the first thing I'm just going to do is share a link, the PDF of those slides, because there's a number of links in there. Rather than spam the chat with those links, you'll just be able to click them at your leisure. Okay. All right, okay, let's get started. So thank you all very much for coming in whatever part of the world, whatever time zone it is for you. Before we do anything further, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we recognise that different customs in different regions acknowledge country in different ways. So please do feel free to use the chat to post your relevant acknowledgement of country. So I and a number of the people on the call here today are based at the University of Melbourne. And so I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered both physically and virtually on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been custodians of these unceded lands for many thousands of years. The University of Melbourne is situated on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, the Yorta Yorta Nation, and the Wadawurrung people. We acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We'd also like to invite everybody today to participate however you are comfortable. So, whether it's speaking, text, video, whatever is possible and comfortable for you, we welcome all forms of participation in the session today. So as I mentioned, the session is being recorded, so just bear that in mind if you don't want your face or audio recorded. We welcome and encourage active participation in whatever way is possible for you. The community meeting notes are circulating in the chat. So if you haven't already, please do jump on and sign up on the community meeting notes and feel free to contribute to that document throughout the session. If you want to tweet us, you can tag the RDA and you can use hashtag RDASDIG. Do feel free to jump over to Zenodo and check out our poster. So we have a poster session for the plenary. You can, of course, see it in the plenary platform and you can see it over in Zenodo. There are a couple of links there on the page for newcomers, which just have a bit of a history of the IG and links to previous community meeting notes. We've had 2 community meetings since the last plenary. Okay, so the schedule for today. We are going to have this quick introduction, followed by some excellent lightning talks, which we're all really looking forward to. Then we're going to have 3 guided discussions, and then there'll be a meeting close and a discussion of next steps. I've included here in this PDF, although I won't go over it now, just a brief overview of the history of the IG, just for any newcomers who might be here. I'm aware some of you have been part of the group before, so this will be familiar, but if it's not, that's just a brief overview of what we've done before. As mentioned, we've had 2 community meetings since our last plenary, and we've submitted the 2nd draft of our charter, so we're waiting for the outcome of that. And to foreshadow briefly our planned activity. So the first thing we have on the horizon is finalising the charter. We've submitted the 2nd revision, so fingers crossed that comes through without too much more comments. We are planning our first outputs. So the 3 key topics that we're going to be addressing in this session today will form the basis of our first 3 outputs. And so we'll be returning to these throughout the session. They form, the basis of our discussion points. We're calling for contributions to the outputs, of course. So we'll return to this at the end of the session, but if there is something in here that particularly strikes your interest, or if it all strikes your interest, get in touch, because of course we are calling for contributors to the outputs. And finally, save the date. Our next community meeting is tentatively proposed for Wednesday, the 22nd of January, 2022 at noon UTC. All right, that's enough. Let's move on to one of the main events, to the lightning talk. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now.
Thanks so much, Crystal, and hello everyone. So now we're going to hear our 3 case studies presented by Lars Eklund, Biru Zhou, and Jörg Geiger. So I'll introduce each of our speakers prior to their talk, at which time they will share with us their experiences of working with sensitive data. And following our talks, we will have time for a brief Q&A before we move on to our group discussions. So each lightning talk will provide us with an overview of the sensitive data our featured speakers work with, how sensitive data is classified in their disciplines and areas of specialisation, the specific types of sensitive data challenges in these fields, similarities and differences in how sensitive data is discussed in different disciplines, and finally, whether this sensitive data is shared between regions and the challenges of sharing. So thanks so much to our three speakers. And now I will introduce Lars Eklund from Uppsala Multidisciplinary Centre for Advanced Computational Science at Uppsala University, Sweden, and the Swedish National Data Service. Lars will speak to us about transitions of sensitivity, contextual change on openness, and just as a little intro for Lars, Lars has worked with code all his life, and after some studies, he's worked in IT for the Swedish Navy before returning to the academy. After some further studies, he worked as a developer on medical devices and as an internet software engineer in Sweden and Canada. Following the internet bubble explosion in 2002, Lars began working in the field of biology, completing a PhD in theoretical inorganic physical chemistry in 2014, after which he worked as a compliance and validation engineer in Recipharm in Sweden. Currently, he's employed as an applications expert at the HPC facility of Uppmax, Uppsala University, and he is a domain specialist in sensitive data for the Swedish National Data Service. In these roles, Lars leverages his broad experience in science, data management, and design to help scientists navigate the data jungle. Thanks so much, Lars. And I hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll try and share my slides here. I have just a few slides to keep myself reminded of what I'm supposed to be talking about. Let's see. Share and that one. Let's see this one. And like so. I hope everyone can see my screen. So the reason I chose the topic of transitions of sensitivity, contextual change and openness is that, as you all heard from the excellent introduction of Alex, I have worked in many different places and with sensitive data for quite some time. And one of the things that I have noticed is that what we work with tends to change depending on where you are and with whom you're speaking. So let's see if I can get. So we have a shifting nature of sensitivity based on context in my experience, and I kind of posed an open question here, and that is it the type or the context that defines sensitivity? So is it the type of data that we're looking at, or is it the context in which that data exists? Because we have the transitions from open and accessible to secure and inaccessible, where most of us want to place the sensitive data firmly in the secure and somewhat inaccessible during the old classic tale of as open as possible and as closed as needed. And when I was working back in the day in the military, I worked with data, among other things, that were related to simple things like salary lists. And these needed to be kept very secure. And actually, the drives that you store them on had to be physically destroyed if they ever were taken out of commission. Because it wasn't enough to just erase them or write over them, because there's possibility to read it. And now I work in the university in Sweden, where the salary information of everyone working at the university is public data. It's open to the public. Everyone needs to know exactly who and what everyone earns. And then the question came to me, has this changed the sensitive nature of it? Well, in the military, the salary data has a strategic value, and that value is what is sensitive. It's not the salary of each employee that's sensitive, it's the information that can be gleaned and leveraged. And the same in the openness and the public of this data is that for the universities, we need to know what everyone makes so that the public can have insight and oversight over what the universities are doing and how they're spending the government's money. So there's 2 points of this, but then the question comes, has the sensitivity of that salary information really changed? I mean, if you know things like what someone makes, you can, using other public information, start to find out quite a lot about a person, quite a lot more than intended. And suddenly this data can be collected and then used for finding that person, for example, by finding out where they live. Even though the address itself isn't stored, addresses for people are public information, and with the information from a salary list, you can figure out where they can afford to buy a home and so on and so forth. And therefore you could figure out where it's likely that this person would live and then find. And for most people, that doesn't matter much. But if you're working with something sensitive, because you also get information of what their title is. So if you figure out that someone is working, for example, with animal trials, then that person might become a target for organizations that can be somewhat problematic. And then that comes to the question, has the sensitivity of this data changed? Has the salary information become less sensitive now that it needs to have some sort of openness? And how do we handle that? Well, it's a very tricky question for me. I have not found a solution to it yet, but that is the type of questions that I have to kind of try and advise the Swedish scientists of. Especially, we've worked a lot on the re-identification and combination of public data to help, especially people that are working in the fields of anthropology and other social sciences, who may use registry studies of things like criminals or other things, to understand what the implications of their de-identified data can be, and whether or not their de-identified data actually is de-identified. And that makes me think that I wonder if we have a need for contextual metadata. So to be able to label data based on what context it is, because do we need to be able to describe how data may be sensitive or how data may be open? And since it's not a black and white situation we are in when we are dealing with these kind of data that can transition from one type of sensitive level or secret level to one other level of openness and sensitivity. So what are the risks when we handle this kind of data, and how do we describe those risks in a concise manner that will help researchers be able to share data as openly as possible? So that's mainly my concern at the current. So I will pass to the next lightning speaker, and I hope that my experience have given you something to think about.
Thanks so much, Lars. That was so interesting. So questions towards the end, if you'd like to pop them in the chat, we invite you to do so. And now I will introduce Biru Joel from McGill University in Canada. Biru will speak to us about support for researchers on sensitive data. Biru is the Research Data Management Senior Advisor in the Office of the Vice Principal Research and Innovation at McGill University. She has a PhD in cultural psychology, and she joined McGill in 2016 as the Associate Director at the Centre for Research on Children and Families. In 2020, she joined the Office of the BPRI, where she continues her journey in the space of research data management by helping researchers to navigate the complex digital research ecosystem. Thanks so much, Biru, and over to you.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Everybody hears me well? Is okay? Perfect. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay. Oh, I think I shared the wrong screen. Sorry about that. I'll try again. Oh, can you see my slide, or you're just seeing my screen right now? You can see my slides? Oh, perfect.
Yes, we can see your slide.
Excellent, sorry. Okay, so today I will be talking about sensitive data classification from an institutional perspective. And then after that, I will introduce a little bit of what kind of support we have here in McGill for researchers dealing with sensitive data as a case study. Okay, so let's get started with sensitive data classification. Well, in this group here, I'm sure many of us will agree that in the most general terms that we can define sensitive data as a catch-all term for personal and confidential information. Our usual suspects include personal information, personal health information, trade secrets, and anything deemed confidential under certain contractual terms. And there's no controversial here. There's a no-brainer. I think many of us will agree on this type of classification. But the real challenge here actually is how we classify the sensitive data. And do we go from the focus of a risk? Do we go from focus from data access, like Lars previously mentioned? And also, do we go from just the pure level of sensitivity or the type of sensitivity data we're dealing with? And here on this slide, you can see there's just I'm just highlighting a couple of institution and organization, their levels of classification. You can see here there are many different ways to classify data from different institutions, and they have different numbers of levels and they have different names. Partially, in a way, this type of this variation in our levels of classification in data in general could be due to in part to the fact that different stakeholders in our research process have different priorities and different concerns over sensitive data in general. I'm not going to go through the entire model here. I will just highlight a couple of points here. For example, at the very center of this diagram is our data subject. It could be human participants and human data. It could be institutional, industrial data, whatever you're working with. So surrounding the center of our data subject, most likely when it comes to sensitive data, we're very concerned about privacy issues, re-identification issues like Lars alluded to at the beginning, and also data confidentiality under contractual terms as well. And if we move a little bit out at the department level, that's exactly where the culture of disciplinary culture and common practice that might come into play, influencing how people see sensitive data and how researchers deal with sensitive data. Are they culture to it? Is it our disciplinary expectation to do it one way or the other? So that's where the variation really comes into play, and that's also tapping into what Lars was saying before, the context around sensitivity. That's where we can observe the most variation from one discipline to another. And at the institutional level, and definitely there's different institutions have different priorities, different strategic priorities, and they are very concerned about compliance responsibilities and compliance to applicable laws, regulations, and policies, and also whether their current infrastructure could actually match the level of classification that is being put in place, and whether that is in compliance with other governing bodies, for example, from the provincial level, from the national level, or even international level. So you can see this is a really kind of complex ecosystem that could be influencing sensitive data classification. But even among these complications, there are some commonalities that we often observe, which is that there are some priorities that are often being put in place when we think about data classification. For example, risk of negative impact on individuals and institutions, and that's more on ethical conduct of research, which we're very familiar with, and also whether the classification we're putting in place is in compliance to applicable laws and regulation and policies, which I've been alluded to before, and also the infrastructure, whether you can match and accommodate effective management and access, storage, and also preservation for your sensitive data according to the different levels you put in place. And there are other classification, other commonality that was observed in our very preliminary analysis with other institutions. That is, usually in most institutions, they put all information, enterprise information, under one big umbrella of classification. So it doesn't matter, is it research or is it non-research enterprise data? So is it a good thing? Maybe. Let's not drive our CIOs and CCO crazy having different systems, but is it also worth it to look into to explore different models, whether we can actually distinguish research data versus non-research enterprise administrated data? Maybe. So this is something that we can all discuss as a group later on, if anybody has any inputs or suggestions on it. And the last part of it is in most of the classification that we look into, they are being presented as like a matrix or grid on different levels. And there's a lack of apparent consideration on data flow. So maybe they do not intend such a grid or matrix being seen this way, but when researchers or people accessing such information, oftentimes it might be misconstrued that this is one static matrix, one static grid, instead of thinking about data flowing from one level of sensitivity to another level of sensitivity during a research process, which could be from open, and then later on ended up at the end of your project, you may be dealing with completely very, very sensitive data. And the other way could be also possible. A typical example would be a survey data. At the beginning, you're collecting a lot of personal health information with identifiable information as well. And then later on, statisticians did their matching with anonymization that we could possibly open up this data, this information to the world to share, to publish it, and then be reused. So hopefully by now I have successfully traumatize you about the complexity of data sensitivity classification, but that's not my intention. And
Biru, I'm so sorry to interrupt. So you've got maybe like a minute or two left?
Sounds good, perfect. I will just quickly go through the services that we offer here in McGill, and recognizing the increasing complexity of digital research world. In the past couple of years, McGill has several strategic hirings. The three of us here, one is sitting in VP research, and one is sitting in my library, and then the other one is our research software director is for VP research and IT services as well. And the three of us, the team of digital research services, where we try to create a one-stop shop to support and accompany our researchers on anything that is related to research, and especially to navigate the very complex digital research system. And there are several initiatives that we have. One is our drop-in session, where we bring all our colleagues from VP, from library, from IT, from ethics in one single spot to allow all researchers to query our panels, any question related to research and research data. And also we have our McGill RDM learning program, fully online, fully self-directed, which has been very popular since the launch in August. And of course, we have our collaboration with a library, very close collaboration to have workshops, DMP reviews, and also our Dataverse as an institutional data repository to help publish our data. So voila, so that's that. And these are the resources that we frequently consult on in our everyday life work. And this is a very preliminary analysis from our side, and I welcome any suggestions and questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Biru. Thank you for talking us through some of those points, and I'm sure our audience has questions. We're going to move on now to Jörg Geiger, who works at the Interdisciplinary Bank of Biomaterials and Data Würzburg, and the University Hospital of Würzburg, Germany. Jörg will speak to us about sensitive data from the biobanking perspective. And as a quick bio, Jörg Geiger completed a PhD in biochemistry and biophysical chemistry in 1996. In the same year, he became a postdoctoral fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center for Clinical Research at Würzburg. And amongst his various roles, he has also been the project manager at Wasserfarm GmbH from 2001, and a senior researcher and deputy director at the Institute for Clinical Biochemistry and Pathobiochemistry from 2003 to 2011. And since 2012, he has been the head of the Body Fluids Biobank and laboratory at the IBWT Biobank. And in 2016, he was conferred his habilitation in clinical biochemistry and pathobiochemistry and became associate professor at the medical faculty at the University of Würzburg. Thank you so much, Jörg. I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you for this very kind introduction, and thank you for the chance or the opportunity to talk a bit about our issues in the field of biobanking. Just a second. So I'll introduce you a bit to our issues, and well, goes on. Yeah. So starting with some definitions, what we're talking about is always personal information. So we're not dealing with other information in our context. And these are the fundamental definitions: personally identifiable information. The other is sensitive information, and it's clearly there's some difference in that. One is the identification, the other part is the really information that are may have an effect on an individual. The short definition basically says it's about harm, embarrassment, inconvenience, or unfairness, which may be affect an individual upon disclosure of this information. What we always think about is what I like this kind of more complex. We have basically three dimensions to look at. It's the ethical, it's the legal, and the social aspect, and we have to have everything in mind and also in sight when we're dealing with these sensitive data. The legal foundation for that is in Europe, the Gdpr, and it's clearly stated what is seen as sensitive personal data. That's genetic, biometric, health data, and so on. I won't go into detail here. You can just read it again. And again, the statement is that the sensitive data is seen as well, data which could create significant risk to the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. So this makes it quite clear where we're going. It's about the risk for the individual. When we're talking about data, there's always some kind of who owns data around, and that's the reason why I just want to drop some lines on that. Actually, there's nothing like a data ownership right. So this there may be some other aspects like copyrights or trade secrets or something like that, but basically there is no right on the data. We do see the individual's data as their ownership. So the researcher does not exercise any sort of ownership on the data, but it's stewardship probably or custodianship, but nothing else than that. So the data stay always to the individual. But we have to look into the ethical aspects, and there's one clear sentence I always draw from the Declaration of Helsinki, where it's clearly stated that the responsibility rests with the researcher, not with the research subject or the individual. Yeah, so even when there's consent or informed consent has been given. So this clearly states that we are, as researchers, responsible for the data. We cannot move it away. So what we have to look at when talking about ethical aspects, we have to keep in mind the self-determination rights of the individual. So this is the right on the personal data, like access, review, and so on and so on. But also the right to information, so that the individual is informed about the use of the data, and particularly a specimen in the case of a biobank, about findings from the data and results from the data, but also got the right not to know about that. But this is a right which has been expressed actively. Yeah, we just cannot go back and state that we actually, well, thought the research subject would not be interested or so. This is not the way to do. And what sometimes not regarded is that the accidental or unintended disclosure. This is also included here. So if the individual does not want to receive any information, yeah, and for some accidental reason the information is disclosed to the, then it's really a clear violation of these rules. Yeah, we got to think about social and cultural implications as well in our 3 dimensions. So we are sometimes we have people from vulnerable social groups with stigmatizing diseases or with certain disabilities, and in the background there's also some religious beliefs or cultural traditions, and all these aspects got to deserve particular attention, and may or do affect very often their perception of data sensitivity. In some social groups, particular data may be of high sensitivity, if highly sensitive, while for other social groups it might not be. So coming to the biobank data, what do we have is basically specimen and related data. We handle it there, and we always have the data and the specimen relating to a particular individual somewhere. And what's often forgotten is that the specimen indeed contains information on the source, in basically the individual then, and any related entities. And so we should not forget that the specimen and the data contain a wealth of information. It's a highly dimensional system, and particularly specimen contain a considerable share implicitly of data. So when we're looking then at the source data, that's the source of the specimen, that can be human donors or organoids or cell lines, which were derived from humans. Just think of the infamous Henrietta Lacks case, yeah, where cell lines were derived from an individual and without consent and everything, and these cells were distributed in the whole world without any information to the one. She has died long ago, but the cells are still underway in the world. Specimen we're using can be tissue, body fluids, hair, feces or so, and all these specimens contain information about the source or the individual. And we got to also collect data, that's biometric data, phenotypic data, health data, clinical data. So quite a wide range of different data which characterize the individual. And that's quite clear.
I'm so sorry to jump in. Maybe another minute or two, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions.
I'll speed up. Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
So that's simply the question, what's sensitive about that? I think this is trivial. Yeah, everyone knows what these relations are. The other one is the specimen, which is more complex. Specimen characterization contains information on the material characteristics, the history of the sample, pre-analytics, and so on, and also analytical data, which were generated from the specimen. What is sensitive then, what is very often disregarded, is the collection itself. It contains implicit information on the donor. The specimen properties, simple properties like staining or state of the specimen or so, already contain information on health and disease of the donor. And eventually, if we're looking at the analytical data, this gives us a lot of information with high dimensional data, genetic data, proteomic data, and so on. And they can give us information on paternity, family relationship, ancestry, susceptibility for diseases, lifestyle, health conditions, environmental conditions, and lots more. So there is so much in that I always wonder why people do not understand that specimens are basically a set of data and more than you can store somewhere, probably. Very often specimens are not regarded data because the specimen can only access with appropriate techniques, but you can extract the data. And it's also not regarded that the specimen can be propagated, as the infamous HeLa cell tells us, where the genetic information of the original patient still resides in these cells and is distributed worldwide. But in current legal conception, specimens are not data and are not regarded as data, which makes it really difficult. So what are our challenges is that the specimen and data are distributed worldwide without basically without any control what happens really in the lab then later. We have very often off-premise data analysis. The specimen, as I said, are comprehensive sources of data, and we cannot control about that and the use. And through the genetic data, with the tools today, it's not so difficult to re-identify, or at least identify relationships within this data. So thank you for your attention, and sorry that I had, there was some overdraft.
Not at all. Thank you, Jörg, and thank you to Lars and Biru for sharing your insights. We've got a few questions, a few minutes now for questions and discussion. Lars, I loved what you were saying about the data jungle, data distractions, and contextual metadata. Biru, you made some really fascinating remarks about the importance of the subjects in defining sensitive data and consideration required for the impact on data flows. And Jörg, I was particularly taken with your comments about self-determination, the right not to know, and the sensitivity of specimens and data collection itself. So I'm sure we've all got questions. So I'll open the floor up, and if anyone would like to perhaps raise your hand or pop a question into the chat. No one has a question? Or all right. So perhaps I can ask then. Oh, hang on. Sorry, Luke's come through. That's good. You don't want to hear just from me the whole time. All right. So Luke is asking, when a specimen consists only of a virus or bacteria, for example, for sequencing, is this sensitive data or not? So I'll put that to the.
No, there's no individual involved. So the virus or the bacteria are not individuals, so we don't regard them as relevant. It's vice versa. If we've got a microbiome sample, so something from feces or so, then you've got the problem that this microbiome reflects the individual's lifestyle and all diet and all this stuff, and then it's really reflecting that. So it's not the individual virus or bacteria, but it's the spectrum of bacteria you find in your even on your skin. This characterizes you and gives information about you. So this makes a difference anyway.
Thank you, Jörg. Any other questions coming through? Oh, Crystal, you've got one. Thanks, you.
Alex. Thank you, everyone. Such interesting talks. Thank you so much for sharing. I guess this leads into our future discussion as well. But many of the models of sensitive data are centered around you know, a human subject, or, you know, a plant or animal. And I'm wondering how we conceive of a model of sensitive data that doesn't center around a living thing. I guess an open question to the panel. Maybe there is an answer out there that I just don't know, or maybe this is something.
I can see, Mark, you've got your hand up. Is that in response to this question, or next one?
Hi there. Can you hear me? So,
yes. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm responding to Crystal's point quite specifically, and this actually comes up in the comment that was who made that comment? Luke Decker. I mean, I think sensitivity has a range of possibilities, and that was kind of what was behind my crazy idea in the chat, which is there are, you know, there's a lot of discussion about sensitive data being purely related to people, individuals, in a sort of GDPR sense. But in fact, there are probably 7 or 8, you know, quick examples of other objects in the world that deserve special treatment. We've got traditional knowledge, cultural information from indigenous peoples. We've got endangered species, which is covered under the Nagoya Protocol. We have in European Union, there's the EU Code of Conduct around agricultural data, which requires special care and treatment for agricultural information for farmers. We have in the refugee community, we have data related to you know, human refugee issues, where this data needs to be treated carefully because it can be used, you know, the sort of the aid activities and the data collected about aid activities can be used by aggressor populations to target the, you know, ethnic cleansing that they've been trying to carry out. So there are lots and lots of examples of this, and this is why I was kind of throwing out this crazy idea that we might want to label things just to get people into the, instead of putting in everything into a linear, you know, it's not sensitive to it's very sensitive. The things that you do at the very sensitive end of that spectrum are very different depending on what kind of data it is. You know, confidential information, business confidential information, trades.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, it looks like maybe Mark dropped out. Lars, you had a response also.
Yeah, it was basically very well covered by Mark, so that's why I lowered my hand. Yeah, no, I think it's one of the challenges that we that we need to look at is when we broaden this outside of the human personal space and to a more larger context. I mean, in general, one could reduce the question in that it in some point will give harm to some individual, as you know, even if it regards to species or whatever, at some point the reason that we feel that we care about it is that some person in itself will take damage from it or feel that they take damage from it. So I think, because I don't think that it's that simple to use ethical dilemmas around inanimate objects without ownership, but that's a very different kind of worms. But yeah, I think that we got a very interesting answer from Mark. So it's we need to. Oh, here he is back again. That's perfect.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more question, and this one comes from Gabriella. So given the different levels in sensitivity, in data sensitivity, what have been your experiences in negotiating with different actors who have something to say about the sensitivity of the data? And if it's okay, I might throw to Biru for this one. Thank you.
Sure. This is a great question. And indeed, this is a negotiation. I think this is the key word here. And a lot of times when we deal with, when you deal with something really open source data, you know it. And or on the extreme sensitive side that you know it. So the classification on the two extremes oftentimes is easier. But then somewhere in the middle, oftentimes you need to indeed negotiate with the actor, in our line of work, we need to work with the PIs and the researchers, and to help to assess which level they fit the most. So our role in our unit and digital research services unit is to enable research, not impede it. So our philosophy is indeed to try to negotiate, to leverage whatever resources that we can facilitate research to happen in an open and secure way. And definitely there's a lot of negotiation between different units within the institution. For example, IT, you need to secure a level that both the institution is comfortable with and both can be usable for researchers and the research team internally and externally. So there's definitely a lot of negotiation in terms of which level that will fit in the best, and we try to put how to liaise with all the different units that is involved in the research process. So it's definitely not an easy job, and there's times that there could be fires, crossfires, definitely, but it's I think at least from our unit point of view, we do try to help researchers on this front to liaise different resources for them to allow research to happen. I'm not sure I answered the question, but usually that's our experience.
Thank you so much, Biru, and thank you to Jürgen Lars also for your talks. So interesting. And now I'm going to hand over to Crystal, who will kickstart a conversation around vocabularies used to understand sensitive data. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. And thanks again to the Lightning presenters. This was a very interesting, I think this is going to lead nicely into the rest of our discussions. So we have just 40 minutes left. So we might sort of, this might become a bit of a rapid fire kind of discussion. But again, just flagging that we will of course continue these discussions at our next community meeting. So do pop that into your calendars. Okay, so right now we're going to start a discussion on the vocabularies used to understand sensitive data. So for this discussion, we'd like you to draw on your examples and experiences, as well as on the case studies just presented in the Lightning talks we've just had. Here we're interested in how we talk about sensitive data. So the terms we use, what we mean by these terms. We kicked off this discussion at our October sensitive data community meeting. So for those of you who were there, you will probably recall that we discussed how having a list of terms, which is used to discuss sensitive data, would be useful for developing a shared understanding and terminology around this concept. We also explored how it would be important to discuss how terms are used and how they're defined differently in different contexts. And this has been a really interesting discussion so far about data in context. So that will feed nicely into this section. So we're going to continue this discussion today. And we have created a document where we can begin working on this resource. And I will share this with you shortly. But first, a bit of an icebreaker. So I'm going to share my screen. And you know what they say about the best laid plans. So let's see if this comes off or if it falls victim. Okay. Okay, so the first thing I think would be really useful to understand is what areas people on the call today are in. So I've just dropped a link into the chat where you can, hopefully this is working, you can click on that and you can just add in your response link there the kind of area that you work in. So, you know, if it's something really specific, like you work in medicine or you work in physics, great. But if it's something more broad, that's okay as well. And if you're working across all fields, do feel free to say so. We'll just give 1 minute for people to pop their responses in who would like to contribute. And of course, word cloud is doing that thing where it's separating words, so sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Great, so that seems to be settling down now. So thank you for that. That's going to be very useful very shortly. So the next thing that would be useful to get on the same page about is the kinds of terms that you find yourself using a lot when you're talking about sensitive data in this field. So I'm just going to share with you another link. So this is a link where you can drop in terms that you find yourself using a lot when you're talking about sensitive data. So, you know, for example, it might be risk, might be secure environments, it might be breach, any terms that you find yourself using a lot. Risk is coming up a bit there. It's a moving feast. Endangered, yeah. It's interesting to see the spread of terms, although risk is gaining a bit of a little bit of ground there. Anonymization, yes. Yep, anonymization has taken the lead. By a long shot. Okay, that seems to be settling down. Yep, here's another one for anonymization. All right, I'll just give that 30 seconds more. Whoa, okay. Just give that 30 seconds more for anybody to contribute there. You might still be thinking about that. Okay, and consent has gained ground as well. Oh, it's neck and neck. Okay. So the next part of our discussion is going to involve thinking about definitions for some of these most commonly used terms. And I think although it's neck and neck, let's take consent. So I'm going to share with you one more link. Let me grab up my notes here. Okay. So at this link, you should find a polling activity where you can add, examples of in your experience, how you have found this term consent defined. So whether that is, like a legal definition of consent, in which case do feel free to, state where you're from and where that definition is drawn from. Whether it's anecdotal, experience of what consent is, that sort of gut feeling that sometimes we we get from working in an area for long enough, whether you've read it in a journal article, you know, whatever. I think it'd be very interesting, and feel free to be as concise or verbose as you like. I'll give that a few minutes for the terms to come in. Yeah, revocable. This is interesting. Enthusiastic. Okay, this will be an interesting one to discuss. Okay, there are specific definitions of consent in research on human subjects. Informed consent in medicine. Yeah. Yes, and I think, you know, later on it will be interesting to think about how these relate. So how these different principles of consent relate. Yes, informed is coming up a lot there. Okay, that seems to be settling down now. Okay. All right, so that survey is going to remain open. So, you know, that polling activity. So do feel free to keep using that. This was a bit of an illustrative example of how we imagine we might work collaboratively on this taxonomy of terminology. I'm going to share that link with you now in the chat. This is now a link to a Google Doc. It should be. Let's see. Yes, it is. Always good. And what's included in this Google Doc is basically what I said at the beginning of this activity. Can you still see that? Can you see a Google Doc? I can see Alex. Can you see it, Alex? Yeah, okay. So a short preamble, which is basically the context setting that we did at the start of this activity, a set of instructions, which is pretty much what we just went through just now. So basically for each of the terms that you use from the list below, and there's a big list below, some of which you just contributed today, some of which were contributed in the community meeting. We'd really like it if you could give a short description of how you use this term or what your definition is. And so, as I said, if you're using a definition like from an article or legislation or whatever, if you could give a citation, that would be very helpful in developing this resource further. So if a term that you use that is not in the list, please do add it. Do feel free to do that. You can just go to the bottom. Don't worry too much about keeping it alphabetical. And if somebody else has already provided a definition, but the way you use the term differs, then please just add your definition underneath. And as a final thing, it would be really useful if beside your definition, you could include the field that you work. So we get a sense of how terms are being used across fields. There's just a general bland example at the top, but also just as much as I could, I'll do some more copy and pasting now. This is an example of how it might look just from our very short polling activity that we've just undertaken. So, you know, you can pop your name next to it and a citation if, you know, one was necessary. And then over here, the field that you work in and how it relates. So I'm just going to do a quick time check to see if we have time to work in this document for a few minutes together now. Let me just have a little look.
Crystal, I think that it's not a problem if we don't end the agenda. All these materials are really important, so we can focus on it. If there are participation after, we will see for the others. I don't know if you are agree, but.
Yeah, this is fine by me, Raman. And of course, we can take the other parts of the agenda and we can discuss them in the community meeting in January as well. So in that case, then maybe we will take 10 more minutes on this activity and then perhaps go to Nicola. Nicola's thumbsing up. That's always good. Brilliant. All right. In this case, then, I would invite you now to start editing right into this document if there's a term that you are using that you would like to add a definition of. And while people are thinking about that, I would actually really like to invite whoever put this comment in, if you are comfortable speaking, please do not feel that you have to, or if anybody who has comments on this would like to tease apart the various aspects of these and how they might be defined as individual elements of consent there. I'm going to stop sharing so that people can see each other, and I see Mark's unmuted.
That was actually me. And I'll try not to press the leave button inadvertently, but I think, you know, we have to be careful because specifically consent is rather well defined. So in research ethics, you know, everybody's got a research ethics activity going on in the university, and there is probably a piece of paper in that activity that defines what consent really means. In medicine, and this applies not only to the use of data, but to, you know, consent to a medical procedure, you know, there's a specific definition about that. And lastly, certainly in GDPR, there are some very specific, there's some very specific language about what consent means. You know, many people have commented on this in terms of it being informed, being revocable, being freely given, not linked to any other sort of benefit for the individual. So I think that needs to be kept in mind. The other thing I would throw out, again, relative to my other comments, is what does consent mean when you're dealing with tribal knowledge or traditional knowledge? What does consent mean when we're dealing with endangered species? Well, there may not be any consent to the you know, handling data related to endangered species. So things like that might need to be considered in terms of the general structure. But at any rate, a few thoughts.
Yeah, very interesting. And I wonder if any of our panelists, Joe, Biru, or Lars, might have any thoughts on how we tease apart that.
Yeah. Just as Mark remarked that, it came to my mind. We had this discussion also. There's one is the if people are not, if someone is not able to really to consent because of age or disabilities, as this is really an issue, and there's a lot of discussion about that. And if it's about minors, it's even more complex because they will later be grown-ups, and so who knows. So this is one part of it, and the other, I think this is also the cultural or cultural background. In some cultures, it's not possible that the individual does not decide. It's the nation or the group or whatever you call it decides on that, and you cannot have an individual consent on something. You got to have a consent of the group in a way by some head of the group or so, or some decision. So this is completely different from the individualistic view we have in Europe, and so this is or in Australia or in America. So this is completely in contrast to that, and it's difficult to understand this concept of consent to communicate this idea of a consent to some people. But you got according to law or to regulations, ethical rules, you got to have a consent. How to carry on with that? So these are real issues.
Yeah.
I would like to continue on what Jörg was talking on here and say that I think that solely relying on consent is problematic in many cases when it comes to sensitive data, because very often consent can't be given, even if it pertains to an individual, but even worse when it pertains to a group or something that is less tangible than a specific person. It becomes even harder to get any form of what could, in a philosophical meaning, be considered a valid consent, because you often have, if you're going to see a physician and they take a sample to your biobank, even if you give a consent, I mean, you've gone there because you are sick, so you have an incentive to be nice, and already there the consent kind of leaves the window. And it gets even more complicated when you have groups, and you may have several different groups that get represented by one person that is not representing the whole of that group, and so on. I know that the indigenous people of northern Sweden, the Sami people, they have had very big issues with that, where they have very complicated structures that are not reflected in how the Swedish government interacts with them. And I don't think either the Finnish or the Norwegian governments either fully encompass this very complex group.
Thank you both for that. Very interesting and useful. And Biro, I wonder if you have observed anything, in relation to what we've been discussing from your perspective at an institutional level, perhaps, because I imagine you see quite a spectrum of sensitive data.
Right. Actually, I agree with what Lara was just saying. Relying on consent alone is indeed an issue. For example, even in perhaps in history and studies of history or archaeology, there are a couple of extreme kind of hypothetical examples that were in conversation with the ethics board. At some point, these are hypothetical examples. So basically, the idea was thinking, okay, let's say you are conducting archaeological studies, somebody's digging up your grandma's old bones. Would you be happy about it? And where do you get consent? So it kind of brings a lot of a mix in terms of whether relying solely on consent and who has the right to consent is an extremely complex issue. And I think we need to first facilitate an ongoing conversation to definitely also possibly explore different models and thinking about consent or perhaps even reconsent for a certain level of data sharing, especially when now we are in the mix of promoting and also encouraging data sharing to facilitate scientific excellency. So in this case, sometimes when we work with data that we may not have put that public data sharing in our original consent form, our interpretation from the Canadian point of view is that we need to obtain reconsent to get to the point that to be allowed sharing. However, that's not always possible, as many of you can imagine in the research world. So it's definitely a very complicated issue, and I think an ongoing dialogue with the ethics board associations and also with the participants that we're working with, and also the PIs, and have knowledge awareness promotion. It's definitely a key to try to find a middle ground somewhere that we can do our research, we can share our knowledge, and but not hurting or harming anybody.
Thank you so much, Guru. That segues beautifully into our next section. But Alex, do you want to add a response to that before we move on?
Just very quickly, Biru, I love that example you gave, because in fact, this is what my research has been in, mortuary ritual and excavation of graves. And yes, I understand that there's different contexts or expectations around the world, but it is also very interesting when particular disciplines or areas of research don't even recognize that like ethics must be applied, or that data that is collected is sensitive at all. And then a challenge becomes, how do you convey that to your colleagues or institutions? And people don't really want more requirements, like bureaucratic requirements around ethics or, you know, in our discussion, sensitive data. So I guess there's sort of cultural challenges as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
May I just add one word, because I just put it down also. What is often a problem is that also neglecting some reservations someone might have, because these consents are very general, and one individual might have the reservations, for example, the use of the data for particular use, use in a particular setting, and this is completely ignored. Yeah. Or it might affect related, I think this is really related people, other people who are not directly asked. And this is also ignored. So the consent itself does not solve the problem, I'm afraid.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much for that. This is such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much for contributing. That document is going to be there, so please, as things come to mind, just jump in and edit it. It's a collaborative document, but this segues beautifully, I think, to Nicola, the discussion Nicola will lead us through about different levels, risks and sensitivities of data. So I'm going to hand the baton, so to speak.
Sure thing, and we'll keep this one pretty short because we are heading on with time. But yeah, my section of this meeting is really to talk about levels of data sensitivity. And one of the questions that I think we'll do a similar kind of thing where I'll give you something to fill out, and then we can talk while we do that, because there's lots of interesting things to discuss. So I'm going to add in the collaborative notes document that we should all be in, so the main notes document, just a table here. So asking what sensitivity classification systems operate in your region or at your institution. So I'm quite interested in, either government level sensitivity classifications, or the, as Spiro was laying out, the different sensitivity classifications that might operate at your university, your research institute. And if you have a link to a document or a resource, that would be fantastic. But I guess the question that, or something that occurred to me as we were talking about this, we're talking about maybe classifying sensitivity in a kind of a dimensional, unidimensional way according to risk, and is that enough, and what does that, and I think the question that I thought of as we were talking about that is, well, it depends, what are these classifications for? Who are they for? And what is the purpose? And I think that that's something I'm curious about. If you talk about, you know, your particular classification scheme that applies to you, you know, how is it used and who is it intended to benefit? What is it intended to, what process is it intended to smooth? What is it supposed to do? And I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that.
So maybe I can say something from a data archive perspective.
Sure thing, thanks.
We have been working on this in the past, but it's sort of an ongoing process. So one of the things that we want to determine, and we want to help researchers who archive their data with us, is basically the level of restriction that we have to put on a data set. So what we need to know is, what kinds of data is in the data set, so that we can advise on whether it can be published and under which conditions. So I think for us, the focus would then be determining that. So that's from the archive perspective in a way. And in the due to the GDPR, so I'm situated in the Netherlands, and due to the GDPR, we now have the policy that any data set that contains personal data will have to be archived under restricted access, for instance. But we're working on sort of having a more fine-grained model of determining, also for a user, determining sort of what level of security and restrictions needed depending on the data.
Yeah, and I think that connects to, so I've been leading an Australian program trying to provide some guidance around different aspects of research data management, and a lot of their discussion of data classification is to do with what particular protections are needed in the systems that are used to manage data, but they talk about this sort of the standard, systems, and then it's like, well, this is just for our base level provision, and then of course there are going to be all kinds of additional requirements, and so the classification for the institutions is not intended to cover all cases. It's intended, as you said, to sort of allow you to provide some like scalable guidance to people about, what it is that they should be using. So I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts? So I see Mark here, a useful concept is that of obligations, prohibitions, and permissions. So it doesn't solve this question of levels of sensitivity, but provides a framework for organizing what needs to be done. And I think, Vera, you presented that there were a couple of different approaches, and one is to classify just according to a levels of risk, and another is to classify in terms of what needs to be done to the data, the protections that need to be applied. Is that a fair?
Actually, so many of the data classification system that we have observed, they actually is a mix of all of those things, that even though they name it differently, which may imply that it could be they're taking from a different perspective, different approach in terms of how they handle the levels of sensitivity in the data. But a lot of times that we do observe that definitely is about the level of risk, and they are very focused on that. And also it's definitely about the kind of whether the way they classify it is in compliance with applicable laws and data governance from, let's say, from the provincial laws and provincial governance, or maybe sometimes even funding agencies and things like that. So there is a component of risk and also component of compliance from an institutional perspective. But as I was presenting the model of the different circles, and definitely different stakeholders in that research process, in that research space, they will have very different approach in understanding the sensitive levels of sensitivity of data. And also they will have different priorities placed upon it as well, in terms of how I should deal with data and how I should allow access or not allow access for that particular data. So I think many people, but who usually be responsible coming up with all those data classification systems would be sometimes it's the CIOs, sometimes it's the IT services, and sometimes it's the VP research office. And so it all depends on the data governance structure within institutions and organizations. And at least that's based on our preliminary analysis on that front.
Thanks. Oh, Roman?
Yes, I agree with all your remarks below. I think that sensitive levels are often conducted by countries' law and government governance. The way to harmonize it is to share objective in a special context. For instance, I have two experiences of this. One about marine biology data. So it's not really highly sensitive data, but we had law in Turkey where they said that no environmental data must be shared with other countries. So they were in a European research program, but we analyzed all the data separately. So it was one horror story, but there are other ones. The other one is the COVID-19 experience. We saw that we have lots of problems to harmonize the data and have metadata, meta-analysis of data. So this experience can conduct countries to harmonize the levels, but we need to have a pool of examples of levels that could be adopted commonly to reach a common goal and common objective.
Actually, I agree with you, Romain. Just quickly make a very quick point, which I did not mention in when I was presenting the little circle diagram, and that is from let's say from if you are working in procurement or grant office from research office, and you are not only need to be aware of your own institution's data classification systems, you need to be aware of other institutions' data classification systems, and also at the government level as well, and any governing body that is can audit your institutional data classification as well. So the reason for that, so is as grant officers or procurement officers, and you need to go to negotiate contracts with other institutions in the collaborative research world. So if we are not having the same kind of system or even similar system, and then it definitely will impeach the level of negotiation, and that means we're not all on the same page. So in this case, it makes it very complicated as well, and it's and having a more harmonized, like Romain was saying, harmonized system may be a good starting point, so that we can work easier from that front on negotiating contracts and drafting DTUs and DTAs and MTAs.
I have lots more thoughts about this, but I recognize that we're 5 minutes away from the end, so I might hand back to Alex, or who is closing for us?
Steve.
Steve. Then I'll hand to Steve.
Yeah, so thanks everyone, and say thanks to all the speakers and session leaders. So yes, we've run close to time, so I think we did have an intent of also trying to talk a little bit. I've lost my session notes now. Where have they gone? Trying to have a bit of a discussion as well about classification. Well, talk about classification systems, but authorization systems. That was classifications, which I don't think we've got time for at this point. So I've gotten myself lost in terms of the notes that I had. There are some next steps that we're wanting to follow, though. Crystal, would you want to pop up your final slide, because that kind of summarizes the next steps there. I've been too busy looking for classification systems to drop into the notes here. So yeah, there we go. Thanks, Crystal. So yeah, so this is the next steps from here, and say for those who aren't already members of the group, as can we encourage you to join the group. From here, we'll really be looking at a series of outputs to pick up on a lot of the discussions that we've had today. So you'll see the themes of today's session really are the basis of the first three intended outputs of the group. So developing and defining a vocabulary vocabularies used to discuss sensitive data, an output related to different levels and risks. That theming of the different classifications of sensitive data and how they're applied, and the thing we didn't get to today, but as I say, we're certainly looking to extend upon how to assess and classify data for authentication and authorization governance. So how do we use those in the management of sensitive data systems and services. This will follow on from where we say we're hoping that the charter itself should be finalised in the next, in a short period of time. The draft has certainly gone to the technical advisory board for review. From here, so from here, our concentration is very much on those first series of outputs, and we'd like to encourage you to contribute to the outputs. So if you are interested in contributing to any of those, I think we've got that in the session notes there, Crystal. You can identify which of those you're interested in participating in further. The work of the committee, the group then continues on with regular community meetings, and we have the next scheduled meeting tentatively for Wednesday, the 27th of January next year. That'll be at proposed for 12 noon UTC, which is let's say late evening in the early time zones and early morning in the North American and South American time zones as well, just for those who are interested. But certainly we'll be looking to pick up on the themes that we've been working through here, and we'll be looking to distribute some follow-up information from today's session. Aside from that, we'd like to thank everyone for being involved, and look forward to hopefully your ongoing participation. Any last comments from colleagues, the colleagues and the co-chairs? On that note, Crystal, yep.
No, beautifully summed up. Thanks, Steve.
On that note, I think we'll say thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll call the session to a close and look forward to seeing you in the community groups into the future.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.